Great, I guess we can begin. My name is Beth Fisher Yoshida, and I am the Program Director of the Masters of Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. I wear a couple of other hats, but for right now, I'm Beth, the Program Director of the NECR program. And today I have a wonderful guest, John Marks, who was one of the founders of Search for Common Ground. We'll get to more to John in a moment. Right now, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We have a couple of other events coming up that we wanted you to know about, should you choose to participate. One is that on October 21st, we have a virtual information session for those of you who might be interested in learning more about the program, which also, if you're on the call today, if you wait till the end, we have our admissions counselor here, David, to talk to you a little bit more about the program, should you have any questions. And then we have another webinar on November 7th, where I have the honor to work with my colleague, Matthias Schranner, who's a founder and CEO of the Schranner Negotiation Institute, and he also has a very interesting background. And so the flow of events this hour will be, I'm going to introduce John a little bit more thoroughly because I've only said his name so far. And then we're going to show a video that John has prepared. And after the video, we'll have a little bit of a discussion. And during that time, I encourage you to please send in questions and comments through the Q&A function, the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and then we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So I hope that's okay with you. And this session is being recorded so that should you want to share it or review it afterwards, you'll have that option to do that. So now for a more formal introduction, John Marks is the founder of the renowned peace-building organization, Search for Common Ground. If you're in the field, I don't know how you could not have heard of that organization. It was founded in 1982 and, excuse me, it was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018. When he stepped down as its president after 32 years, the organization had a staff of 600 full-time employees, and I think John mentioned recently that it's up to like 900 now or something like that, so it's still growing, and offices in 35 countries, so it really is global. He now is the founder and managing director of Confluence International and a visiting scholar in peace building and social entrepreneurship at Leiden University, co-author of the controversial New York Times bestseller, The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, and the award-winning Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Marks also founded Common Ground Productions and has produced TV series promoting nonviolent coexistence in 25 countries. So in case you don't have enough to watch, there you go, more from John. His book title alone, I think, is super exciting and just very enticing, From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. Again, with a title like that, how can you not read it? It offers a timely masterclass in effective negotiation and conflict resolution, and it builds on a core strategy of understanding the differences and acting on commonalities. So I just have a couple of questions here and comments, and hope we have a nice discussion, and we'll get more questions from the audience. So you were mentioning about, and Susan mentioned about be the peace that you want to see, and the concept of self as instrument of change, right? So that the better you make yourself, the more effective you can be in what you are in the world. And so in response to the question, what can I do? It's work on yourself to be a better peace builder. So what are some of the ways in which either you or personally or Susan or other people that you've worked with develop their skills to be these effective peace builders?
Well, in the beginning, I kind of apprenticed with Roger Fisher at Harvard. And Bill Urey was a graduate student then, his co-author in the book. And I learned a lot in terms of how one did this kind of work. But then when I went off on my own, there weren't a lot of models. Most peacemakers, most mediators were sole practitioners, or they would work with another person on a project. But I wanted to form an organization which could do this on a mass scale, on an industrial scale, if you will. And I realized that that would have problems of its own. And when I started off with one other person, it seemed like a very far away dream. But I had to learn through experience, through actually doing the work around the world. I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic or a theoretician.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we see great results. And so I'm curious, of all the different kinds of terminology, I mean, studying with Roger Fisher and Bill Urey and others is great. I respect their work. And you chose common ground. So why did you choose that concept, right, and that approach rather than some other terminology?
It just seemed right. I mean, my intuition told me it was a good idea. I had a board member named John Nesbitt, who wrote a book called Megatrends. And he was a great communicator. And he said that the strongest thing that we were doing was finding common ground. And I didn't want it to give the impression that we were the common ground. So we became Search for Common Ground, which
Oh,
meant we were living in the question rather than having the answer all the time.
oh, very interesting. A lot of times we say that just asking a good question is an intervention in itself because you're asking people to look at a situation in a way that they may not have looked at it before because of the question. So the idea about the common ground, because when we are in conflict, as we know, right, that we think we're just so different and so opposite, and there is nothing in common. But if you go high enough to different meta levels, you'll find something that's in common. That's great. The other thing that really appealed to me in just the title alone in your book, which of course I was reading, is the whole idea about social entrepreneurship. It's when I think about that, I think a lot of work that I've done in Colombia, the youth leaders, the peace leaders and community leaders of conflict transformation, they've had issues about being able to sustain themselves in their organizations, which I think I mentioned to you a while ago. And so they always have to leave the work they've started in order to get a job that has nothing necessarily to do with the conflict transformation or the peace work. But then there are some who are creative and clever and have their own social entrepreneurial endeavors. So if you can speak a little bit more about the whole idea, the concept and practice of social entrepreneurship as you see it.
Well, social entrepreneurship was the methodology that I used as a peace builder. I wasn't so much a mediator. I'm not very good in front of a room or working in a workshop context. Other people do that much better than I do. But my skill was in rearranging things, was getting people into the room, was creating the project in which conflict could actually be resolved. And I recognized that early on. And indeed, my marriage, I was married to a superb facilitator. Uh, Many of the triumphs of the organization came because Susan would be able to come into a room. And our fundamental operating principle was instead of having adversaries face each other as the problem, you wanted them sitting together, taking on a shared problem. And Susan was excellent at that. And I would defer to her, though I was spent more time getting them there and getting them into the room and getting funding and all those kinds of things. Those were more my specialties.
And I think all the roles are important, right? Because once you get them in the room, then what? So,
Yeah.
so Susan was able to facilitate it.
Hmm.
So your methodology, when you talk about your methodology as social entrepreneurship, then what more specifically is that?
Well, I actually developed 11 principles, which came out of my own experience, which talk about or describe the kind of work that I wanted to do. And in fact, in the book, there are 11 chapters, each one of which explains and describes what those principles are about, and then gives examples of how they were actually applied in
Hmm.
real life. So we're not talking theoretically here, we're talking about how you actually do the work. And those were I use the principles of social entrepreneurship to be a more effective peace builder.
Hmm. Yes, one of the things I also appreciate about the book is that it's very practical and people can pick it up and look at it and follow the 11 principles and really be effective. So let's talk about those principles, if that's okay. So the first two chapters are all about vision. It's about start from vision and then be an applied visionary. So if you can speak a little bit about that, that would be great.
Well, I think that every social entrepreneur, every person in the social change business needs to know what their vision is, and need to be able to say very quickly what that is. In my case, it was to transform the world from a win-lose to a win-win place, and that was my overall vision. But to be a pure visionary is not particularly useful unless you want to start a new religion or you want to write a philosophy textbook. But you need to be able to apply that vision. Hence, to be an applied visionary is to be able to put together a project one step at a time, to be able to expand your organization one step at a time, and grand unified solutions to problems, while absolutely desirable, are almost never achievable. You need to go A, B, C, D, and then me, L, M, N, O, P. I mean, in other words, it may not be linear, but it's one step at a time.
Right. And yeah, and you actually have a chapter called Keep Showing Up. So one step at a time and just keep coming back and showing up there. We can talk about that in a minute. We do have a question. What would you say were the biggest challenges in your career in peace building, particularly on such a large scale? And you said your vision was to transform the world. You didn't start small, transform the world from win-lose to win-win. So what were some of your challenges?
Well, there were multiple challenges. One was finding enough money to do this work, developing the resources. Another, I spent 20 odd years working in the Middle East. And let me tell you, it is a challenging region where even though one could have success in individual projects, it always seemed to get worse, not better. And that was a tremendous challenge for me. There was skepticism about that what we were doing was impossible. And sometimes we pulled off things that were possible, and people thought that was pretty cool, but often you couldn't do it. And it's like in baseball, if you're successful 1 out of 3 times, you bet 333 and you're a superstar. In my work, 1 out of 3 successes would have been great, but it didn't make you a superstar.
Yeah, very challenging. So how did you get people or organizations to believe in you, to fund you? Because it's very hard to demonstrate, right, that what you've done is effective, even though you know there's a shift and there's a change in people and then what they're able to do. How are you able to get that support?
One needed to make what I called, or what Fisher and Urey call, yesable propositions. Every proposal needed to be yesable to the funder, which meant it needed to reflect their interest as well as your interest. Many people, when they make propositions, only think of what they want, and they don't think of what the other side wants. And you had to be able to do both. And so that would be an important part. And then you needed to have experience in how to do these things. It took me 5 or 6 years to figure out an effective way of operating. And to be able to raise serious amounts of money to be able to expand. I mean, we were a very small organization in the beginning, and then it helps quite a bit if the culture is going in your direction. It's easy. There's an old saying that it's easier to ride a horse in the direction it's going. And when culture is going your way, or the way you want, it's much easier to operate. And it's very, very difficult to oppose the flow of history.
Yeah, that's such a good point about knowing what is important to your counterpart, because I think a lot of times when people prepare for these kinds of negotiations, they're very keen on their own point of view, their own perspective, what they want, and don't always pay attention enough. And then the whole job is like convincing the other person instead of really, like, and you talk about Aikido too, instead of really working with the other person's energy and goals and seeing where the flow and the fit is there too.
Yeah,
Yes.
official negotiators, diplomats, usually go into negotiations with instructions. on how their home office, their ministry, their State Department wants the negotiation to come out. And that's very different than the kind of things we were doing, where we were just trying to find common ground. We
Mhm,
weren't necessarily trying to find a specific solution. And
mhm,
that's a big difference between official negotiating and the kind of work that I was doing.
mhm. Right, I was referring also to, that is true, and I was referring to negotiating with funders, right? Knowing what would be
Mhm.
important to them, the yesable propositions is really interesting because, how can you not say yes to certain things, right? And we do have more questions from our audience. So in your experience, what is the biggest inhibitor for success in negotiations?
I think that if there's violence going on already, it's very, very difficult to do a successful negotiation. You want to be able to get in beforehand, whereas most governments, who are the main source of money for conflict resolution, usually don't do preventive work. What they do is after the fact, they go in to pick up the pieces. And that's important, but much more emphasis should be put on preventive diplomacy.
Hmm. So in your work with Search for Common Ground, is there a focus on preventive measures by facilitating the dialogue, by identifying the common ground?
Hmm. Yeah, if you can get involved before the shooting starts, is much more likely to be successful. And whereas once the shooting starts, for example, in the Middle East right now, it's very, very difficult to do anything to resolve the conflict except wait for the parties to be exhausted.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. And I was just
Unfortunately.
It is unfortunate, and I was just looking at some of Galtung's work earlier today and thinking about the direct violence that we pay attention to, but when there's all that other kinds of rumbling, the structural or cultural violences, we don't, which is a great opportunity for people to really have a dialogue and see how a civil society can develop. So how did conflict resolution approaches that originated from other countries and cultures influence the ways that you do your work? Do you do
Well,
work?
we out of Search's 600 employees when I stepped down, 80% were from the countries where they were working. And that was very important because the people who understood conflict the best were those who lived in the place, and it was part of their culture. And to be in every country, like there's some certain overriding principles. It's better to listen than to talk if you're going to try to solve conflict. But on the other hand, you need to be very, very sensitive to wherever you are, the place where you're working. And that just was a very important element of what we were doing.
Yeah, I can imagine. Indigenous methodologies, but also how you pay attention and
Yeah.
show respect to
We
them.
often try to combine indigenous methodology with what I would call more modern techniques of conflict resolution. In Morocco, where we did a lot of work, there was a tradition of having elders who would go into the marketplace and resolve conflict, either by arbitration or mediation. But that had pretty much died out with modern modernity. And what we were able to do was to bring that back, but also bring in more modern forms of conflict resolution at the same time. And we also in Morocco worked with a progressive Islamic organization, which brought in, if you will, Islamic teaching into conflict resolution and showed the passages in the Quran which where conflict was actually resolved. And it was a hybrid of the old, the religious, and the modern.
It's a beautiful example, John. Thank you for that. This next question is a two-part question. For the future of peacemaking organizations, do you feel this arena is getting crowded with more partners entering? And what do you anticipate is the future need of organizations? I would imagine peacemaking organizations.
Well, definitely the number of academic institutions teaching this has gotten much more crowded than it was ever before. When I started, there were a couple, maybe two or three programs. Now they're well up, probably over 1,000, even in the United States. But one of the problems is that they're not jobs for most of the graduates in the field. And so they study it and then they can't do it in the
Mm,
actual world. And I think that the future comes in having more organizations of the scale of search. My organization, I felt that if there were 20 such organizations in the world or in the United States, the country and the world would be much, much better off. Unfortunately, there are no major funding sources for the core support that's needed for these programs. Academic programs can get core support, but independent NGOs in the conflict resolution area have to be totally dependent on, or almost totally dependent on, project funding and
mm.
individual donors. And that's a very hard way to achieve sustainability.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that speaks a little bit to what I was mentioning before, when people don't have the funding to sustain themselves. And then it's a constant cycle of looking for funding and looking for funding and looking for funding rather than focusing on doing the work. Okay, another question. Somebody said, I am working as a technical advisor with the civil society negotiators involved in the South Sudan high-level mediation. What's the role of private mediators in international peace processes where diplomacy has collapsed?
Well, sometimes it can be very effective. Sant'Egidio, the Italian-based organization, actually kept a process going in Mozambique when all the official people had gone home and it was hopeless, and they pulled it off. Now that's one of the better examples, and unfortunately, they're not too. I don't know too many others. But I think unofficial private peacemaking, track two as opposed to track one, is a key element in having peace in the world. It's not an either or proposition, it's a both and.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, the track two players really are the link between track one and implementation on the ground, I think. And a lot of times there's a gap. So decisions get made at track one, but there's not enough focus on how do you implement those decisions. And I think track two play an important role in that.
Yeah. One of the things that we discovered that there was a track 1.5. In other words, uh, when we were doing negotiations between Soviets and Americans or Iranians and Americans, the Soviets and the Iranians would have official people there in their so-called unofficial capacity. And that worked very well because it meant whatever you came up with wound up in official channels.
Ah,
We wouldn't invite them to come, but the Soviets weren't about to leave the talks we were having only to the unofficial people.
of course not. How can they trust you though, right? Okay. But you know what? If that 1.5 person, 1.5 track person allowed these things to move forward and happen, then it worked, right?
It, exactly. And, whatever works within your moral code is what it seems to me is
Yeah,
important.
as long as you don't compromise yourself, I agree with that one. Oops, sorry. Okay. And another question. Talking about rearranging the room and facilitating, it seems that both the negotiator's personality and logical communication are significant. What kind of behaviors, personality, attitude is essential to succeeding in challenging negotiating?
They, I think that the best negotiators are born, not taught.
Oh,
I mean, there are
interesting.
things you can learn, but some people are good at this and others aren't. And I'm not particularly good at it, the actual mediating. But most people who come out of the programs like yours want to be up in front of a room or at a table as a mediator. And that's an important part, but it's very different than building a structure, a place to stand for mediation to take place. They're separate skills.
Absolutely. As you're saying that, I'm thinking about, right, there's the whole design and the structure and all the support that's needed. it looks like the person who gets up there is the only thing that's happening and the only work that's been done, but it's not. That's a very important role as well. And I also facilitate, but all the work behind and all the people you work with to support that being successful, I agree. Very, very critical. All righty. Another one. Okay. Peacemakers are often directly impacted the same violence we are working to transform and resolve, etc. After your years in the field, what advice do you have for peacemakers who have hit the wall and are simply exhausted?
Excuse me, I didn't hear that at the end.
Yeah, so it's really about that. When you're working in the field, you're also impacted by the violence and all of that. And after so many years of being in the field, I guess the part of the question would be, how did you take care of yourself? Because she's wondering what happens to peacemakers who've hit the wall and are simply exhausted from all the work, because it is hard and emotionally draining work.
Well, my secret ingredient is found in the Japanese martial art of Aikido. In Aikido, it's not boxing. In boxing, if an attacker comes at you, you confront them, you try to reverse their energy flow by 180 degrees. And I would love to be able to have the power to reverse the Middle East conflict, but I don't have that kind of power. No one has that kind of power. But in Aikido, if an attacker comes at you, you accept their energy, you maybe try to divert it 10 degrees or 15 degrees to find a way to make both of you safe. And to my mind, that's the physical metaphor for conflict resolution. So I wasn't in a confrontation with violence. I was sort of accepting as it was and trying to move it and divert it. And I had a strategy. If I was working in the Middle East and things weren't going very well, well, I would think of a project in Africa where things were going much better. In other words, I was diverting satisfaction. Now, like most people, I like to be satisfied. I like to have success. But, in the conflict resolution field, you're going to have a lot of failure along with the success.
Yeah, so I guess there are different strategies of how to take care of yourself there.
Yeah.
And you're talking about like putting your energy somewhere else, thinking of something more positive, I guess would give you that energy to continue
Hmm.
working in a challenging situation, as well as the whole idea about the flow of Aikido. I also once lived in Japan and studied Aikido, so I agree. It's a very non-confrontational martial art, so you're really working with the energy. And a lot of what we do in the field, right, is about working with different energies that come in when somebody's very hostile or very docile and all that. So how do you work with that energy?
Yeah.
Interesting too.
Yeah. If you stand up and you say stop, it just doesn't work. Though I would like to stop it.
Yeah.
And probably if you do that enough, you're going to burn out. Whereas if one takes this approach of accepting the conflict and then trying to improve it to small in the beginning from small ways, you probably will survive. And I've been doing this work for over 40 years and really never burned out. So for me, it works. I'm not sure it'll work for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have some other of your principles I'd like to go over a little bit. And, in a way, it's sort of tangential, but you said develop effective metaphors. And I know I've done activities like that with people, but what do you mean by that when you're saying develop effective
I
metaphors?
mean that people are not going to look for a new reality or accept a new reality if they can't have a picture of what it is. So the ability to be a storyteller, to be
Mm,
able to show what the an outcome could be is very important. Now, my organization, started to do that through TV production and radio production, where we would actually do major television series in countries in order to have people see another way of acting. And to illustrate how that could be effective, think of America, think of a show like All in the Family, which Archie Bunker. which had a profound impact, as far as I'm concerned, on changing attitudes toward bigotry, or other more modern shows which made gay marriage much more acceptable inside the United States, and changed the percentage of people who thought it was a bad idea or a good idea. And those kinds of things are what we do. We did a lot of what I called soap opera for social change. Now, not every conflict resolver has the ability to make television, but what they can do is be able to create story, pictures, outcomes, and show people how there can be a different reality.
Yeah, I love that. The idea of showing, right, rather than just telling what it is. So, in your video earlier on, you had a program highlighted called The Team, right, which takes place in Kenya, and it talks about tribal violence. And we know that years ago, when there was an election, there was some tribal violence that happened. And I think many people were not only upset about that, but also disappointed because they didn't want that to happen or didn't expect that to happen in Kenya. What are some of the ways in which, if any of the storyline there of the team, that you show that? Because I'm imagining they have some conflict on their team.
Well, what we did was we took the world's most popular sport, soccer or football, as the world calls it, and in every country where we worked, we did this in 18 different countries, actually, 350 episodes. So it
Wow.
was industrial scale production. But in each place, whatever the conflict was, we had a diverse population on our soccer team of people who reflected the conflict. So in Kenya, everybody came from a different tribe. In
Mm,
Morocco, you had urban people and rural people. In the Congo, where sexual violence was a tremendous problem, we had only girls on the team, and preventing sexual violence was the overall theme. And the core metaphor was, if people didn't overcome their differences and play together, they would lose. And that's the core metaphor of sports. And when I
mhm.
say we did in 18 countries, in 16 of those we used soccer or football. In two, we in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, we used cricket. All we needed was a team sport.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. That's great. And I'm sure people really enjoyed working on the production. And you still have all of that going on now?
No, Search has closed it down since I left,
Oh,
um, which I felt was not a great idea. But they do video on a local scale, but
hmm
large national productions, which we specialized in when I was there, is now no longer part of the toolbox.
hmm Yeah, sometimes the vision goes with the visionary, right?
Hmm.
Those kind of ideas that
Well,
happens.
they're doing good. They're doing good work. I'm not unhappy. It's
Yeah,
just when the founder steps down, things change.
they change. And sometimes, it's a healthy change.
Mm.
So we have another question here saying, building on a previous question about what happens to peacemakers, about their own affect, right? So the efforts, do they ever weigh like failed negotiations or failed peacemaking efforts? Do they ever weigh on your mind? And how do you manage those feelings? And what advice would you give to others to avoid taking such setbacks personally?
Well, we played a really important part in the negotiations with Iran on nuclear issues. 5 or 6 years before the negotiators came together on an official level, we brought together unofficial physicists from both nuclear physicists from both sides, and they did what we call technical mediation. They
Mm,
wrote 70-page papers on how to resolve some of the more technical issues. And I, as the president of the organization, couldn't understand a word of it because it was so technical. But it had a profound impact on the Iranians, particularly. And the Iranian foreign minister said after the negotiations that there never would have been an agreement if we hadn't done that preliminary work. But the failure came when President Trump came into office. He negated the whole thing. And so 7 or so years of our work went down the tubes. And I'm still proud of what we were able to accomplish, but I wish it were still in effect.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it may have gone down the tubes in terms of not getting the outcome right now that you want to see, but I'm sure that it had a profound impact on the people who were involved in it, knowing that there's another way that something could happen, even though you
Yeah.
still have leaders that may not buy into it.
Well, well, we showed it was possible, and
Mm.
then they did it on an official level, and that was quite important, and it did have an effect on the people. But you know, when I didn't get into this work because I wanted my work to be negated, and I hoped that this would, you know, be more positive than it's turned out in the end.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that your work and the organization have spurred others to learn from and do the same kind of a thing, same kind of work, or at least aspire to. So, another person has a question about the ability for storytelling, because this person is studying narratology in a Master of Fine Arts. What kind of elements can make storyline effective or productive as blueprint pictures in negotiating? I'm not sure what a blueprint picture is.
Right. Understandable metaphor, understandable examples is what you're looking for. And then you need to have creative people, good writers who can do it. And that can be the person themselves who's into conflict resolution. It can be a friend, it can be a company, but it needs to be compelling on its own terms. And so much of what's done and written about this field is not particularly compelling, at least to me, and one needs to make it understandable. I tried to make my book chatty. In other words, I wanted people to be able to get it without having a PhD in the subject, though it's useful to have a PhD too.
Yeah. When you say understandable, you're also meaning that people can relate to what's there?
Yeah, accessible, compatible. One reason we did soap opera for social change is most people can get into it, and they welcome into their living room once a week familiar characters. And when those characters have positive attitudes and reactions, it's like almost like a friend.
Yeah,
And that's a way of doing it. It's not the only way, but it's a way of showing what better or positive behavior can be like.
yeah. It seems like you're carrying on a very old tradition, right, of storytelling, just using different media to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this has been going on. Every society has a storytelling tradition, and we tried to take advantage of it no matter where we were. But again, we were modernizing it for some of the ancient traditions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And another one of your 11 principles, which I'd like you to explain. I read about it, but I want you to explain it. Expect the Dunbar effect. Dunbar.
Dunbar was a dog, a seeing eye dog. And about a dozen years ago, we were hiring our first blind person who had a seeing eye dog named Dunbar. And I had to ask a lot of questions because we'd never done this before. And one of the questions, you know, can you use a computer? Will Dunbar foul the audience if you have a long meeting, the office if you have a long meeting? But there was a question I just didn't think to ask, which I should have, but I didn't think of it as an important question. And that was, is anybody in our office allergic to dogs? And the answer was yes. And it was my assistant, who I did not want to lose because we had hired somebody who had a dog in the office. So we found a workaround. We put Dunbar and his master as far as possible away from my office and my assistant's office. And if there was a meeting, our normal protocol would be for people to come into my office to talk. But if something involved Dunbar's master, I would go into his office to keep the dog away from my assistant. But the idea of what I call the Dunbar factor is there are going to be questions you didn't think to ask, uh, events you didn't expect to have happen, which are going to happen. And it's inevitable. I've never been in a project where something didn't come up that was unexpected. And all you can do is roll with it and find workarounds and not be discouraged when it happens, because it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's great. And sometimes things are so obvious. That's why I think it's also nice to work with other people because you'll be sitting there and you're very involved and trying to be present, but there's always something else that you're not observing and not thinking of that somebody else can contribute, which lends me to asking you about the another one of your principles, which is enroll credible supporters. What do you mean by credible? That struck me as a very strong word.
When one is starting out, particularly, it's important, it's helpful. It's not indispensable, but it's helpful to have people of note, whether in your field or distinguished people from some other field or famous sports figures or whatever. To have them on your advisory board, have them back you, because you can borrow credibility from people. But for if they put their name on in your agenda on your letterhead, then it can be impressive to funders or other people. It makes perhaps making yesable propositions easier. Now, a word of excuse me, a word of caution. You don't want to give away the store in order to get credible people. In other words, you don't want to change the nature of your organization just to get credible people enrolled. So, as someone, one of my colleagues told me, you don't want to invite people to go on your board who don't have enough to do. Um,
Oh.
you want to, you want people who will be supportive for your venture.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're also saying that you want people who will help you establish the credibility and legitimacy that your name before at the beginning hasn't earned yet, and that they bring that there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important too. And I think that's why people sometimes go and get degrees, right? They have degrees with letters after their names and they say, I'm a student at the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program, or I graduated from the NECR program. And that does add a certain level of legitimacy when people say, okay, you've done this before or you've studied it. But I know one of the questions I've always gotten when I've worked as a consultant in organizations is, where have you done this before? Right? And so if you don't have that, that's a really tough way to get started. So at least if you can somehow say, well, not me personally, but the person on my board or the person here, we have experience in this, and that, then it helps with that transition. So I'm curious,
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think it's good. So, and I like the idea of make sure they don't have too much time on their hands. That was kind of funny little addition there because sometimes they get too much into the weeds. And now, what kind of work are you doing with Confluence International now that you've transitioned into another phase of your career?
Confluence International is an NGO, a non-governmental organization I set up in the Netherlands to essentially be a place for my own work,
Hmm.
my own individual work now that I've stepped down from the larger organization. It's not a really functioning NGO organization. It's a mechanism which I use to have a base from which I still do individual projects.
Hmm.
At my age, you want to keep busy, but on the other hand, I don't work as hard as I once did.
Yeah, you've earned that right. And so, what kinds of projects are you working on now? Like, what kind of work
Um,
are you doing?
did a TV series in Kenya, which was called Ms. President. It was about electing a woman, the next president of Kenya. It was kind of like American Idol in terms of having candidates and elimination. And so it was a reality series, 26 episodes.
Wow.
And by the time we were through, the actual president of Kenya had introduced all the winning candidates to the country. So it had some impact. And now I'm trying to do something in Israel called the Prime Minister, which would be about having a new Prime Minister of Israel, having young people have voted in by SMS messaging. And of course, it's a fable, it's not real, but it seemed to me it might have an interesting impact.
That's, just by the sound of that, where has it started or have you gotten
Let me
anywhere?
say, I'm putting pieces in place. It's a project I'm working on.
It sounds
In the
great.
current atmosphere, it probably is not feasible. But
Yeah.
I've had some interest, and it takes a while to put the pieces in place.
Do you know what really appeals to me about that is I think one of the issues we've had in this country and other places is that younger people are less interested in getting involved in having a political life for a variety of reasons. And when you lose the interest of the next generation or any generation other than an older senior generation, then you lose some of the vibrancy and what's going to happen in the future. So that's a very interesting concept that you mentioned there about having that show because people can get to play it, right, and play around with it. It's not real per se, but they get to taste it and see it, and maybe that will be inspiring for other people to really want to do it for real.
In principle, that's why we do it.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad I caught on to that one. Okay, good. All right, now you also have something here which is display chutzpah. What do you mean by that? Coming from New York, I
Chutzpah,
know what that means, but what do you mean?
chutzpah is a Yiddish word which means to have nerve or audacity to do stuff. And to be a successful social entrepreneur, you need to be able to push into things, to take risks. Starting an organization, go start search for common ground was a big risk for me. And I had to, at a certain point, just dive in, and I did. And that quality is important. But on the other hand, you don't want to be obnoxious. You don't want to be overly pushy. You want to be politely pushy in your work, but you need to be able to push ahead and have the nerve, the audacity to take risks.
Hmm. And did you do that because you preferred to work on a larger global scale rather than as an individual practitioner?
Well, when I started, I thought I wanted to work on a larger global scale. I had no idea how to do it. And I
Uh-huh.
needed to start, I needed to become engaged in it in order to see how to do that. And it took about 15 years before we became global.
Wow, okay. Yeah, so is there anything else I don't think we have any more questions here. Is there anything else you want to add before we bring this to a close, John?
No, you've been very thorough, and I'm very happy with the way it's going.
Okay, thorough is not one of the adjectives I used to describe myself, but okay, that's great. I say I usually am not comprehensive. All right, John, it's been wonderful having this conversation with you. I really appreciate it, and I love the work that Search for Common Ground has done and continues to do. And I'm sure that you're going to continue contributing. And everybody, please look for the book, From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. It's so good. Such a good read. You can just read it and that day, which is one of the things I like, just go and immediately apply something to the work that you're doing. Very, very practical. So thank you, John. The recording